Hello dear friends, you are on the Ruslan Belov channel, and this is the daily analysis of the Ukrainian front. So yesterday, Putin spoke at Valdai, and he was asked a question about the possible delivery of Tomahawk missiles by the United States to Ukraine. If they are delivered, what will happen? The answer, nothing will happen. Putin said, we will shoot them down. After all, Attack MS were delivered before, and they were shot down. The same will be the case with Tomahawks. We will shoot them down. And let me remind you, these are missiles with a range of 1,600 kilometers. Open a map and see what a range of 1,600 kilometers actually means. It is obvious that the United States will not deliver them, since even their closest allies do not receive them. Plus, the launches required for Tomahawks exist in only a handful of units in the US military. Well then, the battles continue, and we continue to study the situation at the front. So friends, I wanted to start today's episode with the good advances of the Vostok grouping fighters, but instead let's begin with another sector, the Doorapoli salient. The thing is, yesterday 2 events took place here. First, we received objective control footage from Zolotoy Kolodets, and this footage confirms that Russian fighters are controlling part of the settlement. Can you imagine? And what about all the fairy tales told by Seversk, Zelensky, and the rest of the propaganda trash claiming that the salient had been cut off? They were already saying this back in mid-August. And what do we actually see? After 1.5 months, the so-called barbershop troops, meaning Azov, failed to drive Russian fighters out of Zolotoy Kolodets, the village located at the very tip of the salient. For 1.5 months, Russian guys, under constant pressure from the so-called elite of the Ukrainian armed forces, have held their positions there and not retreated. Incredible, isn't it? But that's not all. Do you remember, quite recently we even managed to advance on the Doorapoli sector? Right here, we reached the approaches to the village of Zaporizhzhia, even entering the railway station at Mertsalovo. And what do you think happened next? Yesterday, Azov gathered their strength and launched a determined counterattack. And not with infantry units, but with armored vehicles. They deployed several Bradleys. Want to know the result? Well, you can not only know it, you can see it with your own eyes. On video, it is very clearly shown how the Azov fighters ride in their Bradleys, trying to storm Russian positions. And they are set on fire right there. So much for the barbershop troops. In the end, during their peak push, the Ukrainian forces managed to push Russian units back by about 1.5 kilometers. But exactly at that point, 2 Bradleys were destroyed. Overall, the situation on the Doorapoli sector can now be described as stabilized. Yes, clashes continue, but neither the Russian army nor the Ukrainian forces hold the initiative at the moment. They retake some ground, we advance in return, and so on. At the same time, of course, there is no room for relaxation. The threat of the salient being cut off has not been fully eliminated. Yes, positions in Pokrovsk were regained, but Vladimirovka remains under Ukrainian control, and the southern part of Novotoretskoye is still not held by Russian forces. The Ukrainians don't control it either. It is a grey zone. Still, as long as this area here is not secured, and also around Shakovo, relaxation is strictly prohibited, because Zelensky has an obsession with the Doorapoli salient. He will undoubtedly continue to send more and more forces here in an attempt to cut it off. So new attacks will definitely follow. Now let's move on to the advances of the Vostok grouping, as I promised. The fighters had successes on 2 fronts, in the Dnipropetrovsk region and in Zaporizhzhia. Let's start with Dnipropetrovsk. Here, fighters managed to drive the Ukrainian armed forces out of the village of Verbovoye. According to reports from the ground, they fled in panic. They tried to quickly retreat from Verbovoye toward Vishnyovoye using vehicles. Partially, yes, they succeeded in retreating toward Vishnyovoye, but that did not help them much, because Russian aviation immediately began striking Vishnyovoye. According to local residents who remain in the village, 10 aerial bombs landed there within just half an hour. Just imagine, 10 FABs in 30 minutes. Vishnyovoye is an extremely important settlement in this sector, because its capture would allow Russian forces to bring the Pokrovskoye-Guliai-Pol highway under drone control, and soon after under physical control as well. From Vishnyovoye to the road, is only about 5.5 kilometers, even a bit less, with only one village along the way, directly adjacent to this highway. So the main goal for October here is precisely to reach and capture Vishnovoye. In addition, apart from taking Verbovoye, the fighters also expanded the zone of control by about 2 to 2.5 kilometers south of the village, moving in the direction of Zaporizhzhia. This is not done just for the sake of advancing, because there is an opportunity, but in order to increase pressure on Novogrigorovka. By the way, control over the village itself has not yet been confirmed, but from a reliable local source who has provided exclusive information more than once, I know that. How should I put it without revealing too much? Let's just say you will soon see Russian flags there. But there was another important advance in Zaporizhzhia. Let's move a little further down. Look here, the Vostok grouping fighters advanced along a rather wide 7-kilometer stretch of the front. The depth of the advance varied from 1 kilometer to 3 kilometers and even slightly more. If you look at the area of Novogrigorovka, the fighters essentially blocked the village from the north. And from Novogrigorovka itself, as I have already told you, expect good news very soon. They also advanced almost 2 kilometers toward Novovasilievskoye. Overall, the tendency here is toward reaching the Yanchur River, where the main and last defensive line before Guliaipol lies. If that line is breached, the city is doomed. As for timing, it is difficult to predict. The defense line is large and complex, and obviously the battles here will be fierce. There were even reports, I cannot yet confirm or deny them, that the Ukrainians transferred some reserves here. That means they plan to try to hold the Russian army on this defensive line. If you look further south, the Russian army is also advancing in the Poltavka area. Here, the maps were shaded incorrectly because the fighters have already entrenched themselves in the eastern part of the village, and this is confirmed even by Ukrainian sources. Battles are ongoing here. The guys are trying to continue pressing the Ukrainian defenses. They also advanced well along the forest belt, 2 kilometers toward the village of Okhotnitsy. Overall, even Putin noted yesterday in his speech that the Vostok grouping is advancing at a very good pace. And that is indeed true. All of these sectors I just described amount to about 20 square kilometers, taken in just a couple of days of October and on a single front. A more than impressive result. The prospects here are also quite significant. At this pace, by the end of the year, the Vostok grouping may well take Guliaipol under control, or at least put it in a semi-encirclement, fully closing the issue with the town in January or February. What else can be said about the front? Yesterday, Putin said that the Zapad grouping controls 2/3 of Kupiansk. Well, frankly, that is a bit of a fantasy. I see nothing has changed with the reporting that lands on his desk. Yes, there are successes. Yes, battles are ongoing in the city center. But according to the reports that are given to Putin, the center is already under firm Russian control, and fighting is only in the southern part of the city. In reality, battles are indeed ongoing in the south of Kupiansk, in particular in the Yubilini neighborhood. But as of now, there is no firm and full control of the city center, nor of 2/3 of the city. 2/3 means 66%. In fact, the Russian army controls at most 40%. That is the real picture. All right, let's move to another sector, from which also come good reports. The good news is from the Seversk direction. According to data I received from the guys on the ground, the Russian army is advancing, with successful movement south of Seversk. They advanced along the forest belt like this. That's one. Plus, look here, Pereodnoye and Zvanovka are basically divided by just one street. And now that street is under Russian control. Accordingly, it is possible that even right now, Russian assault units are trying to establish themselves on the southern outskirts of Zvanovka. What would the loss of Zvanovka mean for the Ukrainian forces? It would mean not only almost direct access to the city from the south, but also the nullification of half their entire logistics. Why? Because from there it is just 1.5 kilometers to the supply road running through Sviatopokrovskoye. And overall, there are only 2 supply roads left. Lyman-Seversk and this one through Sviatopokrovskoye. Losing Zvanovka would mean losing the Sviatopokrovskoye road, leaving only the Lyman-Seversk road. And I think it is just a matter of a month before that too is cut. So Seversk's situation has worsened significantly. Well, that is all I have for today regarding the situation at the front. Now let's look at what is happening on the political stage. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin spoke at the Valdai International Discussion Club. The main point: we must be ready for anything. The president stated that in the current global situation, the stakes are extraordinarily high. There is no tool against a crowbar except another crowbar, Putin said about world politics. The USSR and later Russia twice declared readiness to join NATO. Both times we were rejected outright. That was in 1954, and again in 2000 during Clinton's visit. Both times we were refused, the president said. Multipolarity has become the direct result of attempts to preserve global hegemony. Russia was ready to work together with Western partners, but they were not ready to abandon stereotypes. The West was not prepared to give up its hegemony. It could not resist the temptation of absolute power. The power of the United States and its allies reached its peak at the end of the 20th century. But there is and will be no force capable of ruling the world. No one in the world is willing anymore to play by rules set somewhere overseas. Never before have there been so many states striving to influence world affairs. All attempts to dictate to other countries what to do have failed. Without exaggeration, this is not hyperbole, not boasting. I believe that today the Russian army is the most combat-capable military, both in the training of its personnel and in its technical capabilities, in the ability to apply and modernize them, to deliver new weapons to the front line, and even in its tactics of warfare. What? Was Russia going to capture Helsinki or Stockholm? Everything Russia wanted to settle with Sweden was resolved during the Battle of Poltava, and all questions with Finland were resolved as a result of the Second World War. Both Finland and Sweden, by joining NATO, lost the advantage of neutral status. If Trump had been in power, the conflict in Ukraine could have been avoided. The Ukrainian tragedy is a pain for all of us. If NATO had not moved closer to Russia's borders, the conflict in Ukraine could have been avoided. For now, unfortunately, it has not been possible to stop the fighting in Ukraine, but the responsibility for this lies primarily with Europe. In terms of sanctions introduced against us, Russia is an absolute record holder. But all those efforts have failed. Those who wanted to make the Russian people suffer should calm down. The impossibility of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia will eventually be understood, even by the most stubborn, dull-witted opponents. Russia intends to attack NATO. It is impossible to believe such nonsense. I watch and do not understand what the Western elites are saying. Do they really believe Russia will attack NATO? We ourselves have never initiated military confrontation. Russia's responses to the militarization of Europe will not be long in coming. If someone wants to compete with Russia, let them try. Russia will never show weakness or indecision. Given the losses of the Ukrainian armed forces, Kyiv should consider starting negotiations. This was also stated by Vladimir Putin. The losses of the Ukrainian army exceed their ability to replenish their personnel. Lowering the draft age will not solve the problem. The elite in Ukraine does not fight while Russia does not conduct forced mobilization. I hope Ukraine will find the strength to sit at the negotiating table. In response to Trump's words that Russia is a paper tiger, Putin said that the Russian Federation today is successfully confronting NATO. But if we are fighting the entire NATO bloc, and we are advancing and moving forward, feeling confident, and yet they call us a paper tiger, then what does that make NATO itself? What does NATO represent? In Europe, a special center has been created to assist the Ukrainian armed forces. Since the Alaska summit, Russia has not become closer to peace and continues to achieve its goals. No arms supplies to Kyiv can radically change the situation in Ukraine, since for the Kyiv regime, there is no magic pill in the form of weapons. Russia remains open to negotiations. President Putin's visit to India will take place before the new year. Preparations are underway. It will be a serious stage of rising tension. The Kremlin is monitoring statements by US officials about possible deliveries of Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. According to Peskov, this would become the cause of a serious new escalation, which would require an adequate response from the Russian side. He also spoke about the deep hysteria in European countries that are trying to paint Russia as the villain. Americans buy our uranium because it is profitable, and they are right to do so. Putin noted that last year, Russia earned about $800 million from selling uranium to the United States. Russia can respond in kind to strikes against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Kyiv should think carefully because there are nuclear power plants on Ukrainian territory, and Russia could respond symmetrically to attacks. Ukrainian sabotage groups have repeatedly blown up power lines leading to the Kursk and Smolensk nuclear stations. Ukraine continues to strike around the Zaporizhzhia NPP, though not at the plant itself. The strikes were on the training center and on power supply towers. At present, Zaporizhzhia NPP is reliably maintained with the help of electric generators, the president stressed. The head of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, is fully aware of the situation at the Zaporizhzhia NPP, Putin stated. While Trump demands that Kyiv's office negotiate with the Kremlin on a peace track, the United States has not introduced new sanctions, but only promises weapons that the Ukrainian forces cannot use. At the same time, Trump shifted all responsibility for what is happening onto Europe, removing from himself the negative consequences of events in Ukraine. The idea of sending Tomahawks to Ukraine is empty talk, detached from military realities. U.S. Vice President Vance said that the United States is discussing the possibility of supplying Tomahawk cruise missiles to Kyiv, but the final decision rests with Trump. Military analyst Jennifer Kavanagh from the portal Responsible Statecraft considers such unrealistic and counterproductive threats to be a manifestation of despair. In her opinion, they would cause laughter in the Kremlin rather than fear. As Kavanagh writes, Ukraine cannot use Tomahawks because it does not possess any of the 3 possible launch platforms for these missiles: destroyers, submarines, or the land-based Typhoon system, and has virtually no chance of acquiring them in the near or medium term. Even if Washington decided to sell Kyiv Typhoon systems, which Kavanagh calls highly unlikely, given that the US has only 2 operational batteries, they would not last long on the battlefield because of their huge size and vulnerability to Russian airstrikes. Moreover, Tomahawks themselves are a scarce and rather expensive munition, and their production takes about 2 years. US stocks are estimated at fewer than 4,000 missiles, with production at under 200 units per year. The Pentagon sells this weapon only to its closest allies and is unlikely to want to share it with Ukraine, especially considering the risk of sensitive technology falling into Russian hands, the article states. Trump is declaring confrontation with New York. The White House immediately used the government shutdown situation to freeze federal transfers to New York. They amount to $18 billion and are spent on supporting the local subway, as well as major infrastructure projects. This was reported by Dudikoff. Among the latest projects is a new tunnel under the Hudson, intended to connect New York and New Jersey. And this is only the beginning. Trump's team promises to completely block any support for New York if, in the upcoming mayoral elections, the socialist Zoran Mamdani wins. And everything now seems to be heading toward that scenario. By the way, the White House is targeting exactly those states represented by its main opponents in Congress. The same New York is represented in the Senate by Chuck Schumer, who is now blocking the adoption of the budget through a filibuster. Until 60 votes are gathered for it, the Senate will not approve the budget, and the government shutdown will continue. In addition, Trump promises in the coming days to begin dismissing officials. The MAGA electorate would not mind getting rid of 70 to 80% of the bureaucracy, since they see it as the embodiment of the deep state. Speaker Mike Johnson holds a similar approach, which is why he sent lawmakers on vacation until the end of the week. Trump has been given carte blanche for purges. American society equally blames everyone for the shutdown: Trump, the Republicans in Congress, and the Democrats. Sooner or later, the Democrats will have to back down, especially if Democratic states continue to face funding cuts, because they cannot last long. The only question is, what will remain of the US government after the shutdown ends? Symbolically, more than 10 years ago, back in 2013, the United States experienced a prolonged 3-week shutdown, which was also connected with Obamacare. Republicans in the Senate then unsuccessfully tried to block the allocation of funds for that reform. But at that time they were in the minority, and now it is the Democrats who are in the same position. The Democratic Party is under pressure from its core electorate, demanding resistance to Trump in everything. Democratic strategists hope that the effect of the shutdown will be negative, primarily for the White House and the Republicans, who control all branches of government. They will try to present them as the party of chaos and incompetence that brought the government to paralysis. But for now, polls show that Americans equally blame both parties for the shutdown.